Today is about ideas, but more importantly, it's about what we do with them. As we mark America's 250th anniversary, we gather to engage the principles of liberty, constitutional government, and free enterprise, and how they guide the future. Our first panel explores a foundational question for the movement. What should conservatism look like in the 21st century? Please welcome Virtue and Liberty, a new fusionism for the 21st century.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being with us today. I'm John Hood. My panel includes Donald Bryson, who is the president and CEO of the John Locke Foundation, Stephanie Slade, who's a senior editor at Reason, and the author of a new book that is just coincidentally entitled Fusionism, Liberty, Virtue, and the Future of the American Right. Paul Mueller, who's a senior research fellow at the American Institute for Economic Research and the author of a recent white paper with a coincidental title, I think, was it Fusionism? So, I think we are prepared to dive into the obvious first question. What in the world is fusionism? We'll start with Stephanie.
Okay, so I think the simplest, when I boil it down to its simplest terms, I say fusionism is the idea that both liberty and virtue are necessary for human flourishing. I think that is an idea that most people can get their heads around, and it seems pretty common sense to a lot of Americans. In a sort of historical sense, this argument was that essentially the Judeo-Christian moral tradition, which prioritizes virtue, and the classical liberal political tradition, which prioritizes individual liberty, limited government, free markets, rule of law, these sorts of things, that these two traditions, the political tradition and the moral tradition, came together in the American founding in a unique way, in a way that was unique in history. And that's part of what we mean, at least part of what we mean when we talk about American exceptionalism, is that combined, fused culture that includes both liberty and virtue as non-negotiable pillars of our culture and our society.
Paul, would you agree with that definition, or would you modify it?
I would agree with it. I think part of the question of fusionism is, what does it mean to be on the political right? And that's become very confusing in recent times in terms of what does it mean to be on the right. And so thinking about freedom and virtue, how do we hold those things together? And what happens when you emphasize one of those and not the other? And so we can see that what happens when you emphasize freedom without virtue, or virtue without freedom, and we've seen some of the excesses that happen when you don't try to hold those things, at least in some kind of tension. And then this goes back to Bill Buckley and 50, 60 years ago, trying to understand, okay, how do conservatives, libertarians work together, but also what is it that we're working together towards? And it's that kind of flourishing that Stephanie was talking about.
So Donald, you've also been writing articles about fusionism. Is there something about the way you see the term or the movement fusionism that's not captured by what they've said already?
No, I think that they generally captured it very well. Stephanie started with the American founding, which well framed this year. Good job. And then, of course, we walked through Buckley and Frank Meyer working together at National Review and coming to figure out, like, how do we get these conservatives and these libertarians to live together and come to an agreement. And I, for whatever reason, several months ago, decided to reread Nicomachean Ethics. Don't know why, just decided to. But Aristotle spends some time in the book talking about political friendship and what that means. And when what the friends define as advantageous to each other changes over time, then the political friendship begins to dissolve. And it feels like we might be reaching or have reached that point where we don't agree on what is advantageous, because we are talking about liberty and virtue simultaneously, but not with the same impetus. And so what does that look like in the 21st century? It is the question right now.
Well, we will get to what it looks like in the 21st century, but I admit that I'm somewhat thinking right now about the 18th century. You've referenced the American founding, all three of you. Would it be fair to describe, obviously the term was not in use, but would it be fair to describe many or even most of the American founders as a kind of fusionists?
I think so. I mean, part of how I think about fusionism is the blending of two terms that don't usually go together, which is conservative and liberal. And so if you think about what's going on in the 18th century, you think about Adam Smith and the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, or you think about the American founders, they are both liberal in the sense of reforming, to have government by the people, of the people, having a constitution, having a democracy, but they're also conservative. They're not radical the way the French Enlightenment thinkers are radical, where they want to sort of undermine all of the old institutions. And so there's a tension going back there with Hume and Burke, and especially Adam Smith and the founders. You see this later in Tocqueville, where they're both liberals and conservatives, and their critics call them both. So the Tories call them liberals, and the liberals call them Tories, and they're kind of in this tension where they want to reform, but they also appreciate tradition and institutions that already exist.
Yeah, and I think that probably many of you are familiar with some famous quotes from the founders, such as John Adams saying, "Our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people that is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." And this idea that we need morality and virtue in our society in order for the institutions that were created in order to divide power and protect individual liberty. In order to have limited government and a free society that can actually survive, you need to have it sort of married with a virtuous culture. That was a thing that the founders, even some of the founders who were not Orthodox Christians, maybe, they still deeply believed that we needed those influences in order for a free society to last. And so that's, I think, very much rooted in the founding.
I mean, I think the Declaration of Independence is not only a Declaration of Independence, but it's a political document showing a fusion of New World and Old World liberal thinkers dissipating from each other. John Adams argued, and Thomas Jefferson wrote down, we were under the impression that we were lawfully born Englishmen and we had natural rights and rights within the common law of Great Britain. The King of England and the Parliament that rules in his name clearly disagree with that. Therefore, we are diffusing ourselves from this vow. And then you find Edmund Burke at the same time in Parliament saying they are correct. We have treated them incorrectly and we should just let them go.
And while many of them use the term Englishmen, there were plenty of people in America and the American colonies who were involved in the American Revolution who did not think of themselves as English, whether they were Scottish, or Irish, or French Huguenot, or German, or Scandinavian, or other backgrounds. They didn't see themselves as being equal in citizenship, equal in rights to people who lived in Great Britain. They were all part of the same empire with the same rights. So I think that it's fair to say that at least the way we think about fusionism today is something that many of the founders would have grappled with. And yet, when we talk about the American founding, we talk about general principles, the tension, it's a creative tension between liberty and virtue and all that. It is possible that people listening to that will get impatient with us and say, it's all a lot of abstraction. It's a lot of just principles that are not connected to anything. We want to solve problems right now. Could there be a case that freedom conservatives should focus more on building coalitions and winning elections and specifying policy reforms that'll work and pushing them through legislatures and pushing them through Congress and not worry so much about the sort of intellectual architecture of it all? Donald?
Yeah, I have a very pointed opinion about this. So we do, one, the internet has changed a lot of things. And if anybody wants some interesting reading on that, I'll recommend Martin Gary's book, The Revolt of the Public, to you. And while the internet has changed a lot of things, human nature has not fundamentally changed at all, ever. We made it to 4 people before we had the first murder, right? Humans are flawed. At one point, one half of the people that Adam knew was a murderer, and it was his son. When we talked about Judeo-Christian principles, and when Solomon writes in Ecclesiastes that there's no new thing under the sun, he's not making some grand theological statement. He's saying human nature has not changed and will not change. Our circumstances may change, how we receive and disperse information change, how we conduct warfare and what our economy looks like may change, but we are all in all the same people that wandered the earth 2,000, 4,000, 6,000 years ago. What we have had with fusionism in the 20th century, and honestly what the founders talked about, was putting virtue together. And one of the virtues that I think is most important for conservatism is that of restraint. And you see this all through the Bible of having the ability to do something, but just because you can doesn't mean you should. Jesus said, blessed are the meek. That doesn't mean the blessed are the weak. It means somebody who has the ability to put force on something, but restrains themselves for the better good. And we have thrown, as a society, as a political society, restraint to the side. We must do something now. We have to act now. We always have to do something now, but without thinking about what barriers are we breaking down and what precedent we set to make things worse on the other side. And I think that's why I was interested in freedom conservatism and why I signed on. Is because let's sit back. Obviously, we are interested in public policy solutions. I run a public policy organization. We want to help fix people's lives right now. But I'm also concerned about the amassing of concentrated power and what that means long term for my children.
So, Stephanie, Donald says, yeah, we need to get specific and have policy solutions right now, but we have to think about timeless human nature. But I still want to restate my obviously devil's advocate question of, is there a lot of value in talking about the past, the intellectual architecture of our movement, as opposed to just getting into the specifics? I mean, is there value in writing whole books about this subject? What was the name of that book again? Fusionism? Does it come out in August?
September 1st.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, obviously there will always be a place for political coalition building, for campaign work, for putting together policy agendas, and policy advocacy work is all very important. But I think this really is a moment for going back to first principles, because I think there is now, in a way that maybe 40 or 50 years ago, or 30 or 40 years ago, at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was a sense of consensus, again, as Ovik was talking about, a sense that, the liberal democratic capitalist way of life had triumphed, and so we didn't need to be spending all of our time explaining why our ideas were the right ideas. This is not that moment. This is a moment where there's a lot of confusion and division about basic first principles. What do we believe and why? And I think until you answer those questions, what do you believe and why? Then what's the point of winning an election if you don't have anything to guide you about what you're then going to do with that power once you've acquired it? There's such a hunger right now. There's such a sense that our politics has been reduced down to just the sort of naked pursuit of power for power's own sake, with no conversations about, toward what end. And so I think we have to answer those questions. And the other pieces I always think back to Friedrich Hayek in 1947 when he founded the Mont Pelerin Society. He said that we as intellectuals should not concern ourselves with what is currently politically practicable, what the voters want right now. Our job as intellectuals is to grapple with the ideas and put ideas out there into the bloodstream so that 20 or 30 years from now, new things will be politically possible. But if we don't do that work, that hard intellectual work now, to set the stage, to lay the groundwork for future political change, then it will never come. This is the idea that all conventional wisdom is actually the ideas of some dead economist, right? You have to do that work up front, though, and then play a long game to have actual long-term change. You can win an election tomorrow by lying to voters or lying to yourself, but that's not a long-term strategy for actually accomplishing things.
Paul, in your paper for AIER about fusionism, you talk at some length about thinking about fusionism as a coalition, but also that a coalition can't simply be an assembly of people who have sort of ephemeral common interests right now. There has to be something more that binds that coalition together through thick and thin.
That's right. I mean, I think part of why I wrote the paper and part of what we're trying to do here is grapple with the problem that's been highlighted here, which is the intellectual drift that we see, even among very popular, even a lot of well-known folks. So you have podcasters, really well-known podcasters that are really vibe-casters, right? How are they feeling today or this week? And you see some of these very high-profile people on the right who are just sort of drifting in all kinds of random, crazy directions. And it's, what's going on? And there's a kind of element of that intellectually, too. The post-liberals were alluded to earlier. In an intellectual sense, I think we see that as well, where there's this kind of drifting of, are you conservative, or are you kind of like a social democrat, or are you, a socialist? Like, what's going on? And it's because, I think, as has been alluded to on the panel, you have to have a sense of grounding. Like, what are the principles that you're operating out of? What is the goal you're trying to achieve? And it can't just be what makes me successful, what gets me power in Washington. It can't be that immediate pursuit of power. And so we need to define, well, what is it that we care about? How is it that limited government is connected to free markets? You can't have limited government without supporting free markets in some way. And you can't really support free markets without supporting limited government. And then I think the other piece, going back to the virtue tradition, is you also need a belief in a transcendent moral order, and you have to be able to talk about all three of those things, the moral dimensions, the government dimensions, and the market dimensions. And I think what we see in some of the intellectual confusion on the right is a misunderstanding or willful ignorance of the economy, of markets, of supply and demand, and just wanting to pretend like those things don't matter. And we've seen, because of that, a lot of drift into not great directions.
Can I add something? The traditional fusionist sort of framework says that government's job is to protect people's basic rights and liberties. That is government's job. And if it does that job well, then it creates the freedom and the space for us in the non-governmental sphere of our lives, in everything outside of government, to pursue virtue, to join together with our family, our friends, our neighbors, in the business sector, with our hobbies, in all the vast space outside of government. We can individually and together pursue virtuous lives. So in the governmental sphere, liberty is the highest value. In the non-governmental sphere, virtue is the highest value. And it's ultimately the point of having government protect liberty, is to allow us to then pursue virtue. So, when you were asking the question, I was thinking to myself, to a certain extent, I worry sometimes that our movement has spent too much time and energy focusing only on how do we get good outcomes in the governmental sphere. And it's important, of course. It's important because it relates directly to human prosperity and flourishing. If we have the material goods that come from good policy or that can be destroyed by bad policy, that matters. But we also have to care a lot about making sure that we're building the non-governmental institutions that allow people to use their freedom to build good lives. And I think we haven't done as good a job in recent years of doing that and of answering the question. When I look at why are young people being drawn to these radical ideologies, I think a big part of it is because they're hungry for answers to basic existential questions about what does a good life look like and how do I build it? How do I pursue? What does that even mean to pursue a good life? They don't have the basic roadmap that many of us, I think, in previous generations took for granted.
Well, and just to add to that, part of the challenge is it's relatively easy for us to agree on sort of a limited government, free market as free cons, but when it comes to what are the dimensions of virtue, what is the right way to order one's life, then it becomes, there's a little bit more disagreement. And this is where pluralism is a bit of a challenge, right? Where we don't necessarily run our families quite the same way. We might be in slightly different, or maybe very different religious traditions. And so the question is, can you have this sort of pluralism while still believing that virtue and morality exist? The good life is something that is attainable, and there are some ways that are better of living and others that are worse, even if we don't all agree on what that exactly looks like. And how do we hold those things in tension?
So I take the point that one conception of fusionism is the top political value is liberty, but that's not the top value. The top value is the pursuit of the good life of virtue. But I wonder if there still there aren't some cases where government is acting and it still has to make a decision about virtue. An example of a free-con type solution to that has been very popular, has been growing in lots of places, including now a federal program that's nationwide, is educational freedom, school choice. That you've got government funds, either direct funding or scholarships or tax credits or something, but you have some public investment in education. But instead of everyone having to, in order to use that investment, you have to go to a district-run public school. You have a variety of other options, and one of the criteria that parents use, in fact, arguably the reason why school choice blew up so big in the last several years, is not necessarily, I'm confident my kid will learn calculus more quickly, or I'm confident my kid will become more fluent in a foreign language, but this school that I'm choosing more comports with the values that I want my students, my children to learn, and that the educational process itself is not really value neutral, at least in lots of ways. So I want to be able to opt towards an alternative that inculcates and reinforces the virtues that I'm teaching my children. So, marriage is another case where the state doesn't just say whatever. There's actually a legally sanctioned institution that we believe if people get married before they have children, that that's good for them. But it's also, as was said earlier, if you have lots and lots of single-parent births, you have lots and lots of family disorder and breakdown, lots and lots of addiction and other, you're going to have a demand for government. It's going to be difficult to deny it. So it seems to me, while I totally get and buy this distinction, there are practical situations where it's hard to say government is not going to be interested in virtue too. I'll start with Donald and I'll come back around.
Sure. So we throw the term virtue around and we jump around it, but we'll just assume that we're talking about a Judeo-Christian centric idea of virtue in America. But I think this is where the populists and national conservatives, and when I say populists, I mean populists on the left and right, sort of turn themselves into a pretzel, because you can't simultaneously say that your own virtue system is superior in the way that all people should live, and say that it's so awesome and yet so vulnerable that we have to force people to do it, right? It can't be so awesome and superior if you have to make people do it. I think that there probably are places where government comes in, because every decision we make as a government, whether we're a legislator voting on a bill or as a person, every decision we make is a moral decision. This is the teaching of Jesus. If you look at the parable of the talents in Matthew 25, it's about the master going away, and he's given the servants bags of gold to invest or do something with. And the two that did something with the money, right? They were given time, talent, and treasure. Those were the good and faithful servants. But the one who hid it away and didn't do anything, who made no decision, made no economic decision at all, that was the one who was cast out of the vineyard. And so I still think that the virtue of the government is one of restraint and one of neutrality. I send my kids to a private Christian school, and I think that is good. And I would urge a lot of people to do that. But I think that we allow families to enter into that marketplace of ideas. I think that when you embrace school choice, that means that vouchers go to Christian schools and non-Christian schools, including Muslim schools and Buddhist schools, and non-religious schools altogether, sports academies, and all of those things. And you let those ideas compete out. And I am comfortable enough in my own definition of virtue that I believe that I know which way the market will go. And so as we come together and collude to put this society that we call America together and vote to send people to Congress and people into the White House, then we have to believe in the legitimacy of those elections, and that the people that we have sent there will somehow trickle up, our virtue will trickle up into that. Although I can't say much for the current Congress.
Stephanie.
I would just say that I think a big part of the reason that school choice is so important is because schools are a place that cannot help but be in the business of inculcating values, and therefore choosing which values are the right ones and the wrong ones. And I just don't trust government to do that. And so I want to make sure that nobody is forced, no family is forced to allow the government to be the ones who's adjudicating that for them. I want families to be able to send their kids to whatever school they believe is right, based on whatever factors they consider most important. There are going to be edge cases, there are going to be times when government has to make a decision about what is the definition of marriage, perhaps, or something like that. But I just don't trust government to be the entity determining what virtue means or how people should be living their lives. I think we need a government to protect people's rights and liberties. I think it should be focusing on doing that. And to the greatest extent possible, we want it not in the business of making those decisions about what does virtue look like. That is not, I do not trust the government for that. I want to make that decision for myself, and I want other people to have the freedom to make that decision for themselves, again, as individuals and as members of communities.
I think a big part of the divide is national versus local, because I think a lot of difficulties are brushed over when we only talk about the national. Because you're absolutely right. I mean, what is the rallying cry? Drag queen story hour. Something's going to happen at the library, and the library is kind of a public space. Or if you're in a small town and you're doing a parade, what is the decorum? What are the rules? What are the things? The public-private distinction becomes very blurry when you get down at a very granular local level. And so, yes, at the national level, protect rights, very neutral as much as possible, leave things to local levels. But at local levels, you have to make decisions about these things. How are we going to run the parade? Who's going to run the library? What books are going to be in the library? How is the library governed? How is this? And again, in a more sort of libertarian world, we would just like privatize everything. But given that we're probably not going to move that way, or not going to get all the way there, we can work towards that. But a lot of people are not hardcore libertarians, and so we need to think through, okay, how do we infuse liberty, but also think about the virtue questions, the public order questions, the norms of behavior questions, decorum questions. And again, I think that is part of the problem we're seeing as a country right now that we're trying to grapple with. And we need to have an answer to that.
So I want to come back to something, Paul, that you have in your definition, the three parts of your definition of fusionism, and kind of drive it a little bit harder. Is it possible for an effective conservative movement to encompass people who do not accept the existence of a transcendent moral order?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I like the way that I sometimes put in economics. There's an Austrian school of economics. Then, are you Austrian or not? And I like the term fellow travelers. So I think that we can have sort of libertarian friends who maybe don't believe in a transcendent moral order, who can maybe be fellow travelers for certain kinds of political coalitions. But it's going to be very difficult if you don't believe that virtue matters or that it exists. If you take sort of a radical, my preference between vanilla and chocolate is no difference than your preference between monogamy and polygamy, right? Somehow there's something different going on here. And so part of the challenge, if you really wrestle with this, part of the challenge is, okay, how do we navigate some of these moral questions and virtue questions, whether in private discourse or in public policy, when we disagree on some of those foundational things. And I think, a Hayek and a Russell Kirk disagreeing a lot are generally in a very similar kind of tradition. You get along. Russell Kirk and Ayn Rand, they might both agree the government shouldn't be taking your stuff, but beyond that, they're going to have a lot of disagreements. And so I think that transcendent moral order brings an element of where we're operating within a similar kind of tradition, as opposed to coming sort of orthogonally to each other.
Stephanie.
Yeah, I guess it depends what you're asking about. The conservative movement, if we're talking about if I'm talking, as I do, about fusionism as a philosophical synthesis, not as a political coalition, then I think it has a definition, and part of that definition is at the very least, a deep respect for the Judeo-Christian moral tradition. Maybe a person could be an atheist and say, I don't actually believe that Jesus was the Son of God, but I think his teachings offer the best roadmap for life, and that maybe is good enough for me to be part of the fusionist family. But there's also the questions about who should we partner with to try to get good policy enacted or try to accomplish other goals. And in that case, I don't think they all have to agree with what I believe philosophically necessarily. I work at Reason magazine. Reason is a secular libertarian magazine. Many of my colleagues are not religious, but they believe, and so therefore I don't know exactly what leads them to their libertarian political views. Because my libertarianism flows out of my belief in the dignity of the human person that was created in the image of God. That's not what they believe, but they do believe in the dignity of the human person. They do believe that people deserve to be free and that we should respect others' freedom the same way that we would like them to respect our freedom. I don't know how they get there. I don't know what it's grounded in, and so I don't think that I would call them fusionists for the most part, but I think we can certainly work together to try to advocate for good policy.
We might call them fellow travelers. So, last question, and I'll start with you, Donald. Thinking about fusionism as a philosophical synthesis, or as a coalition, or as a set of principles, or whatever, what is your take right now on the present and future of fusionism? What are its prospects? Are you hopeful, or are you pessimistic?
I am short-term pessimistic, and by short-term I mean next 2 to 3 years. I'm long-term optimistic, but I think that there's going to be a good bit of creative destruction in the American political order. And I'm not saying there's going to be a civil war. Please don't walk away and say Donald Bryson said there's going to be a civil war. But I do think that what the new fusionism looks like will be different. I think that there will be a big reordering of American politics. But I think that whatever that looks like for the people gathered in this room, it will have to start with a coalition that begins with a skepticism of power. I think that is where the coalition has broken down overall. If we bring some people back into the fold, I think that's entirely possible post-2028. But I also think there are people on the left that are starting to see, hey, perhaps we shouldn't have pushed the power of government quite so much to push our worldview, because now that we are not in power, it's not quite so great. If we think that government will push virtue, it will also push all of the worst parts of human nature, right? Again, human nature has not changed. There is nothing new under the sun. Solomon is giving general human wisdom when he says that. And so that means that all malice and avarice and all of those things that can come out of being human that we have in our darkest moments that we don't like to talk about will just be amplified when we concentrate it into the power of government, particularly federal government. And so, that's why I say in a lot of ways small government is just risk aversion.
So, Paul, optimistic or pessimistic?
I'm generally optimistic, sort of by disposition. But I think I would say, that ideas and political philosophies are actually a lot more like fashion than we might want to acknowledge. And fashions change and they come in and out. And I think that part of my optimism is that I think we're coming a little bit out of a period where fusionism, this sort of freedom conservative, has been kind of out of fashion. I think it's going to come back into fashion in the future for a variety of reasons. And so we can spend a whole panel talking about, the fashionable elements.
No, we can't.
Well, not today. But I am optimistic on the whole. I think there is going to be a lot of disruption. There's a lot of problems. But I do think that as long as we show up, these ideas will become more fashionable again.
Stephanie, you've got the last word.
I'm hopeful in the medium to long term. I basically agree with that. I don't love the idea, though, of a new fusionism. Sometimes people will ask me, do we need a new fusionism? And because I define it the way I did at the outset here, as the idea that both liberty and virtue are necessary for human flourishing, I think that is an eternal truth. It doesn't stop being true. We don't need a new fusionism. We need to revive the truth.
It's a new birth of fusionism, I think. Well, thank you all very much. I think we're going to move right on to the next panel. So we'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists for helping us think more deeply about the philosophical